Moral self-cultivation and moral legitimation. Admittedly, for Hume, the establishment of justice is only the beginning of his political theory. His more eminent concern is with the moral approbation of justice, and this, he argues, is attained through the sympathy with public interest. Similarly, for Xunzi, the creation of the condition of justice is not an end in itself. Its prudential foundation needs moral approval and legitimation. Not only should the boorish man become the public citizen, but the public citizen must further become a man of moral character. Therefore, in the second stage of his philosophical system, Xunzi's predominant concern is with moral cultivation. But how is moral self-cultivation possible in the absence of innate moral resources, sentimental or otherwise? How are the people able to transform prudential obligation to Confucian justice into moral obligation? Or how can they turn interest-based civil society into a morally elevated state of the kind that Confucius and Xunzi would have endorsed? Like Hume, and in agreement with Xunzi, Xunzi does not argue that morals are produced from interest, however publicly and civically reconstructed. Clearly, for Xunzi, the enlightened self-interests are not directly equal to morals. For Hume, the transformation of an interest-based civil society into a moral civil society poses no problem given the inner resources humans have, namely natural moral inclinations and sympathetic social interactions enabled by them. Xunzi's monistic philosophy is completely free from this problem because he does not even posit the distinction between enlightened self-interest and morality and between moral and civic virtue. Here again, the virtue-ethical interpretation of Xunzi's virtue politics encounters a difficulty, insomuch as it maintains that in Xunzi it is morals such as benevolence, sense of justice, ritual propriety, and sense of right and wrong that are created through reformation of bad human nature. However, as noted in Xunzi's civic political framework, the products of human artifice are primarily justice and other supporting civic virtues, such as orderliness and self-restraint, not so much morals themselves. If, as the dominant interpretation of Xunzi's moral philosophy maintains, Xunzi posits no innate moral inclinations, how is moral self-cultivation, which he emphasizes strenuously throughout the Xunzi, especially in books 1 through 3, possible? But consider the following statement by Xunzi. Anyone on the streets can become a Yu, an ancient sage. How do I mean this? I say that by which Yu was because he was Ren, Yi, lawful, and correct. Thus, Ren, Yi, lawfulness, and correctness have patterns that can be known and can be practiced. However, people on the streets all have the material for knowing Ren, Yi, lawfulness, and correctness, and they all have equipment for practicing Ren, Yi, lawfulness, and correctness. Thus it is clear that they can become a Yu. Now, if Ren, Yi, lawfulness, and correctness originally have no patterns that could be known or practiced, then even Yu would not know Ren, Yi, lawfulness, and correctness, and could not practice them. To be sure, Xunzi, unlike Xunzi, does not claim that humans have articulate moral inclinations, such as 4 sprouts that each correspond with the 4 virtues. This, however, does not lead to the presumption that in Xunzi's morals, such as Ren, Yi, Li, and Zi, have no basis in human nature, even though their refinement requires deliberate human efforts. The text above clearly shows that some factors in human nature are essential for the production of morals. According to Xunzi, every human being can become virtuous, even become a sage like you, because they all possess the material or capacity for knowing basic morals and also have equipment for practicing them. Again, unlike Xunzi, Xunzi does not fully explicate what the innate capacity for morals consists of, or whether it is a sort of moral sentiment. But clearly for Xunzi, the original impetus for knowing and practicing morals comes from within. Of course, this does not mean that people do not need teachers and ritual and yi, tools employed for moral education. As Xunzi powerfully illustrates in Book 4 of the Xunzi, people tend to go astray when their passions are not restrained, and they need ritual and teachers by whom to be corrected. But as noted earlier, the existence of antisocial passions and the possibility of going astray are logically independent of the metaphysical claim that humans are inherently good or bad. Human tendency to go astray, which Xunzi claims is an empirical, not metaphysical or moral cosmological truth, is compatible with human capacity for morality. Seen in this way, it is less convincing to identify Xunzi's model of moral self-cultivation as reformation model and contrast it diametrically to Mengzi's development model. It seems that for Xunzi, artifice, way, includes a variety of deliberate human endeavors, of which reformation or correction is only a part. He indeed wants to reform a petty man or a boorish man into a gentleman, and his reformation model holds whenever people go astray. However, Xunzi does not seem to believe that the gist of moral self-cultivation lies in the reformation or correction of bad human nature. Rather, he seems to be much more interested in the wholehearted devotion to and steady accumulation of moral goodness, which involves improving and developing one's natural endowment, and in this regard he is not markedly distinguished from Mengzi. Xunzi says integrity is what the gentleman clings to, and is the basis for government affairs. If you act steadfastly and do not let it go, then you will improve. If you improve and fully develop your endowment, moving forward for a long time and not returning to your beginning, then you will be transformed. Only when, Xunzi stipulates, people have become morally cultivated, at least to a certain extent, will they be able to appreciate the ruler's moral virtue and, further, honor him like Shang Di, Lord on high, be closely attached to him as to their own parents, and be glad to go to fight to the death for him and jeopardize their lives for him. Only with the morally cultivated people can the condition of justice, prudentially originated, be morally legitimated and politically secure. Then, ultimately, the political order will be self-regulating and self-perpetuating, leaving the ruler and the government with few things to do. Conclusion. 2 kinds of Confucian virtue politics. In this essay, I have argued that Xunzi differs from Mengzi not because of his so-called seeing a thesis, but because of his implicit distinction between morals, concerned with moral goodness of a person, and civic virtues directly related to public interest, and his unique conception of justice. My core argument has been that, 1. The main, if not exclusive, target of Xunzi's reformation model is the unruly human behavior, and its purpose is to produce the condition of justice and other civic virtues that buttress it through ritual institutions, li, and social norms, yi. And 2. For Xunzi, morals are still rooted in some factors in human nature, though exactly what they are remain obscure. According to my reading of the Xunzi's reformation model is primarily a model for civic self-transformation to produce public citizens, therewith the condition of justice and public interest, understood in terms of constraint, nourishment, and refinement of passions and desires, although this political project is ultimately intertwined with the broader ethical project of moral self-cultivation aiming at the development of moral character. Though I was occasionally critical of the dominant interpretation of Mengzi and Xunzi as similar kinds of virtue ethicists, focusing on its failure to discern Xunzi's implicit distinction between moral and civic virtue, this failure is not without a reason. The reason becomes salient once we compare Xunzi with Hume. Hume's moral and political philosophy has both Mengzi and Xunzian elements. The sentimentalist origin of morals and the artificial creation of justice and accompanying institutions, and Hume does not seem to be troubled with the pluralistic outlook of his entire philosophical system. Neither Mengzi nor Xunzi, however, was a self-conscious philosophical pluralist, although, as I have illuminated in this paper, Xunzi's philosophical system is leaning towards this direction, especially in comparison to Mengzi's. As equally committed to the one right way, called the kingly way, both Xunzi and Mengzi posited no inherent tension between a good person and a good citizen. This monist structure of the seamless continuum between morals and civics and politics is most salient in Mengzi's, when he weaves moral self-cultivation with regulations of the family, the regulations of the family with the government of the state, and the government of the state with the ordering of the world by means of his moral psychological method of extension. Otherwise stated, Mengzi derives civic virtues and political principles from morals, moral sentiments and virtues, by extending the latter to the former. Xunzi fully agrees with Mengzi that politics and civics must be based on morals, and therefore he is equally convinced that politics, in its most proper sense, must be virtue politics. What differentiates Xunzi from Mengzi is his remarkable political sensibility to the horror of the state of the nature and astute awareness of the foundational importance of the condition of justice, predicated on ritual institutions, however important the ruler's moral character is in principle in maintaining them. In motivating the people, uncultivated and preoccupied with narrow self-interest, to subscribe to ritual socio-political institutions and create the condition of justice, Xunzi submits self-interest should be better utilized. The problem is that Xunzi does not make this prudential component to his political reasoning obvious, and occasionally presents the Confucian body politic that he espouses as if it hangs solely on the ruler's moral character. That is, Xunzi, as a committed Confucian, does not seem to want to disclose the secret, which Mengzi has completely dismissed, that moral virtue is in reality buttressed by the institutions of prudence. Apparently, contemporary Confucian virtue ethicists are reluctant to embrace the argument that Xunzi's virtue politics is predicated on the prudential considerations of self-interest. They seem to believe that embracement of self-interest tarnishes the philosophical coherence of Xunzi's virtue ethics. Drawing attention to the congruence between moral motivation and moral behavior, one of the core stipulations of virtue ethics, Confucian virtue ethicists maintain that to be qualified as virtuous, an action must be propelled by virtuous intention and moral disposition. However, if their deeply held assumptions that virtue politics is only a subset of virtue ethics is reconsidered, and if the meaningful, albeit implicit distinction between moral and civic virtue is acknowledged, Xunzi's prudential political theory does not have to be seen as a compromise to his virtue ethics. After all, Xunzi does not argue that moral actions are motivated by prudential considerations. The Xunzian moral agent does not act morally for the profitable consequences of her action or to derive pleasure from it. Instead, her moral character disposes her to act morally, and she takes joy in doing so. Xunzi's argument is only that self-interest is an integral component to the institutions of ritual and yi. Thus understood, what makes Xunzi a prominent thinker in the history of Confucian political thought is not necessarily due to his theory of human nature, which is less articulate than Gaoxi's, but rather due to his distinctive understanding of Confucian virtue politics. That is, by critically engaging with Mengzi, who made an authoritative definition of Confucianism as a character-based virtue politics tightly grounded in virtue ethics. Xunzi reconstructed Confucianism as a special kind of virtue politics, undergirded by the pluralistic distinction between moral and civic virtue, and between individual morals and public interest, without positing any foundational theory of human nature. Xunzi's legalist students, most notably Hans, made interest, along with power, the center of politics by dismantling the institutional connection between virtue, ritual, and politics, and divesting interest of its public character. In doing so, Hans legalism not only departed from the mentioned sentimentalist virtue politics, as he consciously did, but it also parted company with Xunzi's more overtly political theory of Confucian virtue politics.